Why in the world do Russian tanks keep doing this? Since the start of the war in Ukraine, the West has discovered a critical vulnerability in Russian tanks. But the reason why Russian tanks keep blowing their tops comes down to two reasons, and they're both pretty dumb. The mighty T-72 and T-80 were developed to take on Western tanks in a nuclear battlefield on a NATO versus Warsaw Pact grudge match to the death. The winner would inherit an irradiated world, and the future of the global wasteland could only be one of two things: a capitalist utopia with a McDonald's in every super mutant camp, or communist workers' paradise, where you and all your ghoul friends would own the means of production. In the inevitable struggle for the fate of all humanity, both sides knew that it would come down to a slugfest between their mightiest tanks. The West took one approach to tank design, the Soviet Union took a different, far dumber approach. For the West, it was all about technology, with Eastern Europe giving every citizen the option of either queuing up for the most basic necessities or serving in the army. The Soviet bloc fielded a terrifyingly massive army that the West simply couldn't match. To neutralize the Soviet numbers, the West decided that it would double down on technology and pack its tanks with as many fancy sensors, the most sophisticated armor, ultra-smart firing computers, and tea kettles. Looking at you, Britain. This resulted in some of the most legendary tanks ever built. Names you might recognize today, like the M1 Abrams, the British Challenger, and the German Leopard. The Soviets looked at Western tanks and said, "Niet, manpower is cheap. Quality is better than quantity anyway," and then decided to take an altogether different approach. Rather than field technologically comparable tanks, the Soviets would instead focus on making many tanks, thousands upon thousands of tanks, because to the Soviet Union there wasn't a problem in the world that couldn't be solved with the application of judicious levels of tanks and armored personnel carriers, especially pesky little things like revolutions by citizens yearning to be free of the Soviet yoke. Now, to be fair, the Soviets were sort of forced to make many cheap tanks, as they were typically several steps behind the West in the development of different key technologies. Thus, the Stalin adage of "quantity is a quality all its own" was adopted, and when asked how many tanks he wanted, each Soviet premier simply kept answering yes. But what's this got to do with Russian tanks taking gold at the turret-tossing Olympics today? In the West, crew survivability was given a premium. However, Soviet forces were almost expendable by design. Russia's notoriously poor logistics aren't just a modern accident, it's basically baked into the post-Russian military. The Soviet military also suffered from bad logistics. To this day, Russian forces still haven't palletized their supplies, meaning instead of using forklifts to move large amounts of conveniently packaged supplies around, they do it pretty much by hand in boxes. In the Soviet playbook, they figured they were going to take massive losses anyway, so why bother keeping units resupplied? Private Conscriptovich and his mates would fight until they were either dead, out of ammo, or both. If they managed to limp back to friendly lines, then great, they could do it all again tomorrow. Thus, when some Soviet engineer pointed out a critical design flaw in Soviet tanks that would end with the crew dead or exploded into orbit, he was promptly ignored. In order to protect the crew, Western tanks included blowout panels for the tank's onboard store ammo. That way, in case of a direct hit to the vulnerable ammo storage, the resulting explosion would be funneled via the blowout panel harmlessly out of the tank. Designers were happy, crews were happy, nobody got turned into an involuntary astronaut. The Soviets saw the design of blowout panels and said, "Hold my potato vodka." Not only did they decide not to include blowout panels, they basically did everything they could to turn every single Soviet tank crew into volunteer cosmonauts. The West has also made some confounding moves themselves, like the Germans deciding the best place for their ammo storage was in the left front of the tank. Now, on one hand, this kinda makes sense. The front of the tank is the most heavily armored and thus the most likely to survive a direct hit. On the other hand, tanks are meant to drive head-on to enemy fire, so we think you see the problem here. The Leopard's armor is rated to survive at least one, possibly two hits in near vicinity to the same spot from anything Russia can throw at it. But at the same time, any penetration to the front left flank of the tank is going to result in the driver probably getting turned into overcooked bratwurst. However, the Soviets took the cake in terrible design decisions. If the West could endanger one of their tank crew's members, well, then by Stalin's whiskers, the Soviets could do better and just straight up murder their entire crew. Thus, the Soviets decided to put their ammunition basically ringing the turret floor, in effect seating most of the tank's crew directly over the highly explosive ammunition. This is termed the fatal design flaw, the jack-in-the-box flaw, because the moment that ammo cooks off, the tank commander and one other crew member are going to enjoy a brief but very intense career in the Soviet Air Force. But the design does make some amount of sense. Placing the ammunition low and centrally to the tank means it's best protected from penetration at any angle. Ammo stored in the turret itself is vulnerable to rear or flank shots, while the position of ammunition low in the tank and center to the body itself means it's much less likely to take a direct hit. However, the widespread use of two different weapons has turned this carousel system into a hilarious, spring-loaded death trap for modern Russian crews. The first is the use of anti-tank guided missiles. In the old days, anti-tank missiles would try to bore straight through the tank armor itself to kill the crew inside. Today, though, ATGMs instead are usually fired in high trajectories that see them come down on the tank from above, forming an explosively shaped penetrator milliseconds before impact that disables the tank. Surprisingly, while the tank commander is usually toast, the rest of the crew has a chance of surviving, as explosively formed penetrators or EFPs are not explosive themselves. It's meant to simply tear into the tank and disable the turret, as well as destroy mechanical and electronic components in the way. Because tanks can't be well armored from everywhere or they'd be so heavy they can barely move, tank designers have been historically forced to sacrifice armor plating on the top of the tank, which is statistically the least likely part of a tank to get hit. However, having a superheated slug of explosively shaped metal tearing into your tank from above directly over the turret has obvious implications for any tank where the ammunition is stored directly under the turret. The second weapon being used in Ukraine are large anti-tank mines, which are designed to detect the vibration of tank treads and after a short delay fire an explosive blast upwards. Once more, the underside of the tank is not very well armored, because if other tanks are firing at the bottom of your tank, you've done something terribly, terribly wrong. But tanks are designed to literally drive over minefields, so they do have some protection from mines, which is why anti-tank mines are between 5 to 10 times the size of an anti-personnel mine. And here we can see the problem with Russian tanks again, because in essence you're having an explosion go off directly under your ammo storage. While the crew is likely to survive rolling over an anti-tank mine, even if their tank is probably going to be disabled, there's little hope for survival when your tush is just inches away from dozens of pounds of explosive primer. Russia is aggressively winning the turret toss Olympics in Ukraine, with some turrets calculated to have been blown as high as 250 feet in the air. Turrets have been even found lodged in the upper floors of Ukrainian apartment buildings. But it's not just bad design, it's the Russians just being bad at war in general. Tanks are pretty terrifying things. If you've never been around one, having 70-plus ton armored behemoths thundering past you is pretty terrifying, even if they're on your side. They're meant to take the worst punishment an enemy can dish out, then break the teeth of enemy defenses while shoving themselves down the enemy's throat. But in modern war, tanks have a pretty bad allergy to anti-tank guided missiles, and the primary destroyer of Russian tanks in Ukraine has been man-portable ATGMs. It isn't a threat unique to Russia. During both invasions of Iraq, US and coalition tanks faced the threat of ATGMs, and yet for some reason Western tank crews didn't become voluntary astronauts during the conflict. And that's because of infantry, as the best way to protect tanks from enemy infantry with anti-tank missiles is not more tanks. Seriously, Russia, get with the program, and yes, we're talking about you, Terminator. In the West, armored assaults are backed up with infantry, whose job is to neutralize enemy anti-tank teams. Yet, despite learning absolutely nothing from having their tanks and BMPs absolutely wrecked by Chechnya in the First Chechen War, Russia continues to fail to use infantry and armor side by side. Actually, we take that back. Russia did learn something from losing hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles to a rebel force with none of their own, and it was to build even more tanks to protect their tanks. Once more, here's looking at you, Terminator. Without infantry support, Russian tanks have been getting mauled by Western ATGMs, and the only reason that Russia's attempts to break turret-tossing world records have slowed down in recent months is not because they've learned their lesson, but because reports from the Ukrainian front line state that the Russians are having to consolidate the remaining tanks and use them only sparingly. In the US Marines, there's a saying, every Marine, despite their job, is a rifleman. In Russia, thanks to bad design, every tanker is also, briefly, an airman. Ready for more lulz? Check out an honest look at the Russian military, or click this other link instead.